Welcome back to Real Crime Stories, the podcast that brings you crime stories from around the world. Today, we discuss the story of Daniel Serafini. He once stood on Major League Baseball mounds, thousands of fans chanting his name. He had the money, the fame, the future every young athlete dreams of. But somewhere along the way, Daniel Serafini lost everything: his career, his fortune, his dignity. And in a desperate attempt to reclaim what he believed he was owed, he would commit an act so cold and calculated it would destroy not one family, but two. This is the story of how a celebrated pitcher became a killer, and how a single piece of surveillance footage would eventually bring him down. But before we get to that chilling video of a hooded figure approaching a lakeside mansion, we need to understand the man behind the mask. Because Daniel Serafini wasn't born a monster, he became one. And to understand how, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when the future seemed limitless and failure felt impossible. Born in San Francisco, Daniel discovered his love for baseball as a teenager, and he wasn't just good, he was exceptional. Scouts traveled across the country to see him. Coaches built teams around him. Journalists predicted greatness. By his early 20s, Daniel achieved what millions only dream of: a spot in Major League Baseball. He pitched for top-tier American teams, then crossed the Pacific to play in Japan's prestigious professional league, where American players are treated like royalty and paid accordingly. At 31, he was living the American dream. Magazine features, massive paychecks, endorsement deals, VIP access. The kind of life that makes you believe it will never end. But professional sports careers are brutally short. The average MLB career lasts just 5.6 years. Most players are out before 30, with decades of life ahead of them and few transferable skills. Daniel played hard on and off the field. He gambled big. He lived large. He spent money like it would never stop coming. So what happens when the cheering stops, when the contracts dry up, when the phone no longer rings, but the bills keep piling up? That's where this story truly begins. In 2007, Daniel's world collapsed. He tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs during a routine screening. He claimed Japanese doctors had prescribed the substance for medical reasons, but Major League Baseball didn't care. Rules were rules. He was suspended for 50 games. Overnight, the Golden Boy became damaged goods. Teams that once chased him wouldn't return his calls. His reputation was destroyed. What followed was a downward spiral that would have broken most men completely. Minor league teams with little pay and nearly and almost an empty stadium, failed investments has consumed his savings. A bar business that hemorrhaged money and crushing debt that climbed to $14 million. Yes, you heard right, $14 million. Creditors called non-stop. Legal threats filled his mailbox. The shame was unbearable. His parents mortgaged their home to give him $240,000, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. The debt was far too deep. He will need a large sum of money to settle debtors. His marriage collapsed under the weight of financial desperation. Divorced and broken, Daniel moved to Nevada, a shell of the man he once was. The stadiums were gone. The crowds were gone. The future he imagined had evaporated. Then came what seemed like salvation. A mutual friend passed along a phone number, 10 digits that would change multiple lives forever. It belonged to Spor, a young woman Daniel had met years earlier when she worked as a horse trainer for his family. She was 19 at the time, passionate, ambitious, and the daughter of wealthy California real estate investors, Robert Gary Spor and Wendy Wood. Now newly single and desperate for a fresh start, Daniel made the call. Aaron flew from California to Nevada for a date. The romance was immediate and intense, like a fire that consumes everything in its path, and it would not end in love. Within months, they were inseparable. In 2011, Daniel and Aaron exchanged vows on a Hawaiian beach as the sun set over the Pacific. Soon after, they settled into a sprawling 5-bedroom home in Reno, valued at $1.1 million. From the outside, it looked like Daniel had somehow beaten the odds. A beautiful wife from a wealthy family, a luxury home in an upscale neighborhood, a chance to rebuild, to reinvent himself, to leave failure behind. But this is where you need to pay close attention, because this is where the cracks began to form. This is where the seeds of everything that followed were planted. Erin came from serious money, old money, built over decades of careful investments and smart decisions. Her parents, Gary and Wendy Spor, had amassed a real estate fortune most people could only dream of. Adventurous and well-traveled, they lived abroad in places like Afghanistan and Hong Kong during the 1970s and 1980s, before building a massive portfolio back home. Among their properties was a stunning lakeside mansion in Homewood on Lake Tahoe, valued at around $5 million. Altogether, their estate would eventually exceed $23 million. And Daniel. Daniel brought nothing to the marriage but debt, shame, and a burning hunger for the life he'd lost. Do you see the imbalance, the dependency, the resentment waiting just beneath the surface? From the start, Daniel's relationship with his new in-laws was tense. Gary and Wendy were not thrilled that their daughter had dropped out of dental school for a washed-up baseball player drowning in debt. They had paid for that education, invested in Erin's future, and now, in their eyes, she was throwing it all away. The Spors were angry with their daughter and the decision she had taken to be with a washed-up baseball player who had no future in sight. At one point, they even threatened to sue Daniel for the tuition money they had already paid. Imagine those early family dinners, the forced smiles, the uncomfortable silences, the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Eventually, the anger cooled into an uneasy truce. Erin seemed happy, and that mattered. She and Daniel had 2 children, one born in 2017 and another in 2020. Erin ran an equestrian center on their Reno property, pursuing her passion for horses. Daniel found work as an equipment operator at a remote Nevada gold mine, far from the bright lights of professional baseball, but steady work nonetheless. But beneath the surface, resentment was building like pressure inside a sealed container. Daniel had become completely dependent on his in-laws. Gary and Wendy paid for housing. They covered childcare. They wrote check after check after check to keep their daughter's family afloat while Daniel struggled to provide. And then there was the detail prosecutors would later focus on, the clause that revealed the true motive. Before the wedding, a prenuptial agreement was signed. If Daniel and Erin ever divorced, he would receive nothing from the Spor family estate. Not a dollar. Everything would remain with Erin. Let that sink in. A man who once had millions is now financially dependent on people who didn't respect him. People who reminded him with every check how far he had fallen. And if the marriage ended, he'd be broke, alone, and starting from nothing. Again. Arguments became constant between the 2 families. Fights over Daniel's failed investments. Explosive debates about politics and lifestyle choices. Bitter disputes over a $1.3 million renovation to the Tahoe house that Gary and Wendy wanted to be done their way. The money kept coming. So did the resentment. And somewhere in the darkest corners of Daniel Serafini's mind, a solution began to take shape, a permanent solution. What no one realized was that Daniel wasn't alone. Someone else was involved, someone dangerously close to the family, someone who would eventually become the key to unraveling everything. Her name was Samantha Scott. She was Erin's close friend and the nanny for Daniel and Erin's 2 young children. She was in the house constantly. She knew the routines, the schedules, their secrets and their weaknesses. And at some point, she became far more to Daniel than just hired help. Daniel and Erin had entered into an open marriage, an arrangement that allowed relationships outside the marriage. Unusual, perhaps, but one they claimed worked for them as they claimed. Within that arrangement, Daniel and Samantha began a relationship, one that would ultimately lead straight to murder. What promises did Daniel make to Samantha? What future did he promise Samantha for her to believe in the whole plan? Did she know what she was agreeing to? Or did the full horror of the plan only become clear when it was too late? Keep those questions in mind, because we're now approaching the darkest chapter of this story. It was a Saturday, early June in California, warm, bright, and cloudless. The kind of perfect day that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen, like the world is safe, like everything is fine. That morning, Erin loaded her two children, 3 years old and 8 months old, into the family truck and made the hour-plus drive to her parents' Lake Tahoe home. When they arrived at the stunning lakeside property, Gary and Wendy were overjoyed to see their grandchildren. And calmly, the children had done what time and distance could not. The relationship between Erin and her mother had softened, healed. There's something about grandchildren that can heal even the deepest family wounds. And since the boys had been born, the relationship between Wendy and Erin had improved dramatically. The family spent the afternoon on the water. Gary took them sailing across the lake. The children laughed and splashed as the boat cut through gentle waves. The sun warmed their faces. For a few hours, old tensions faded beneath the California sky. 3 generations together, making memories they believed would last a lifetime. That afternoon, Wendy wrote Erin a check for $90,000, another financial lifeline. Just a week earlier, they had given Daniel $70,000 directly. The generosity never stopped, even as the resentment it fueled continued to grow. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in orange, pink, and gold, Gary went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. It was peaceful. It was perfect. Exactly the kind of evening people imagine when they picture their golden years surrounded by family. At 7:45 p.m., Erin kissed her parents goodbye, buckled the children into the truck, and headed back toward Nevada. The headlights disappeared down the winding mountain road. But here's what no one inside that beautiful lakeside home knew. They were not alone. They hadn't been alone all day, and the nightmare was already in motion. Earlier that afternoon, while the family was out on the lake, neighborhood surveillance cameras captured something chilling. A figure dressed entirely in dark clothing, face hidden beneath a hood and a white mask, a backpack strapped tightly to his shoulders, walking slowly and deliberately toward the Spor residence. This wasn't random. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was someone who had studied the house. Someone who knew every entrance, every blind spot, every room. He knew where the family gathered. He knew when the family would be back from the outing. He knew their routines. And most importantly, he knew exactly when Erin would leave with the children. So he waited, hidden somewhere inside or near the property, patient and still, listening to the sounds of laughter and dinner preparation just feet away. When the family returned from the lake, nothing seemed wrong. They cooked, they talked, they laughed, they discussed grandchildren, wrote checks, and made plans for the future. And when Erin's truck disappeared down the mountain road, carrying the children away from what was about to happen, the masked figure made his move. What followed took less than 2 minutes, but those 120 seconds would destroy lives forever. Gary Spor was 70 years old, a successful businessman, an adventurer, a sailor. He loved the ocean. He adored his grandchildren. He was planning scuba trips for his upcoming birthday. He never saw his killer coming. The intruder approached from behind and fired a single shot to the head. Gary collapsed near the fireplace, never knowing who had ended his life, or why. Wendy barely had time to register what she was seeing before the attacker turned toward her. She was 68 years old, vibrant, compassionate, and known for helping foreign seasonal workers find housing at local ski resorts. She raised her hands instinctively, trying to shield herself. It wasn't enough. 2 shots struck her head. Another tore through her hand. The weapon was a .22 caliber pistol fitted with a crude homemade silencer, a plastic tube designed to muffle the sound. It worked just well enough. Neighbors heard a strange, dull noise, something that didn't sound quite right, but nothing that made them call the police. The attacker slipped away as quietly as he had arrived. Gary Spor was dead. Wendy Wood lay bleeding on the bathroom floor, clinging to life. And here's the detail that still haunts this case. It was Wendy's dog who saved her. The family pet found her and licked her face desperately, again and again, until she regained enough consciousness to reach for her phone. With 2 bullets lodged in her head, somehow, through sheer will, Wendy managed to call the police. She couldn't speak. The operator heard only gasping, labored breaths, and then silence. When paramedics arrived, they encountered a scene that made no sense. A wealthy couple was attacked in their own home, yet nothing was taken. Gary's Rolex was still on his wrist. Wendy's diamond bracelet still glittered on her arm. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacking, no theft. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't random violence. This was a calculated execution, but by whom and why? The Lake Tahoe community was shaken to its core. Local police hadn't handled a murder in more than 2 decades. This kind of brutality didn't belong in a place defined by million-dollar homes and peaceful lakefront living. Wendy survived, but recovery was brutal. The gunshots left her with catastrophic brain injuries. She had to relearn how to walk, how to speak, how to eat. Everyday functions became daily battles. And the cruelest part of all, she couldn't remember the attack. The trauma erased it completely. She couldn't describe her attacker. The one witness who might have solved the case was trapped behind amnesia. Investigators reviewed the surveillance footage of the hooded figure, but the mask made identification impossible. They canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed everyone connected to the family. They came up empty. Adrienne, the younger Spor daughter, became the public face of the search for justice. She held emotional press conferences, pleading for information, and offered a $150,000 reward. Erin and her husband, Daniel Serafini, were notably absent. Detectives also noticed something else. Daniel's cell phone, normally active with hundreds of messages, had been turned off during the exact window of the attack. Coincidence? They didn't think so, but they couldn't prove it, not yet. In February 2022, the case was provisionally closed, but the story wasn't over. In 2023, investigators caught a break with motel surveillance footage. Cameras showed Daniel and Samantha Scott checking into a Nevada motel the night before the murders, together, entering and leaving, a digital record that Daniel couldn't explain away. Daniel's alibi began to crumble. Wendy, meanwhile, was unraveling emotionally. She suspected her son-in-law. Worse, she feared her own daughter may have known more than she admitted. The weight of that suspicion became unbearable. On March 9, 2023, Wendy Wood took her own life. She was 70 years old. Before she died, she disinherited Erin, leaving her only half of the Lake Tahoe house. Even in death, Wendy was pointing a finger at part of her family. On October 20, 2023, Daniel Serafini and Samantha Scott were arrested in Nevada. The former MLB pitcher was found living part-time in a trailer. The fall from grace was complete. Both were charged with Gary's murder and Wendy's attempted murder. Facing life in prison, Samantha's loyalty broke. On February 6, 2025, she pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Daniel. Her testimony was devastating. She described driving him to Lake Tahoe, watching him test a homemade silencer, dropping him near the house, waiting for hours, then helping him escape and dispose of evidence. They even exchanged love letters in jail, fantasizing about a future together. The 6-week trial laid everything bare. Furious emails Daniel had sent to his father-in-law, testimony that he'd offered $20,000 years earlier to have Gary and Wendy killed, A mine foreman who recalled Daniel openly saying he wanted his in-laws dead. That $70,000 check Wendy gave him weeks before the attack. Daniel used it to buy his dream car. Even his own brother admitted the hooded figure looked like Daniel. On July 14, 2025, the jury found Daniel Serafini guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and first-degree burglary. Special circumstances of lying in wait and felony murder were confirmed. He now awaits sentencing, scheduled for February 20, 2026. 1 week after the verdict, Aaron filed for divorce. The sisters remain locked in bitter civil litigation over their parents' estate. Gary Spor was adventurous, generous, and loved life. Wendy Wood survived the unimaginable, only to be consumed by grief. And Daniel Serafini went from packed stadiums to a prison cell. That surveillance image, the hooded figure approaching the house, remains one of Lake Tahoe's most haunting reminders. Because sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes the monster is already inside the home. Thank you for listening to Real Crime Stories. Share your thoughts on the story, like and subscribe to the channel. Until the next episode, stay vigilant.